Let's be real here. Say it, dig it, and analyze it. That's Deep Story. Thanks for tuning into Deep Story. I'm MPT. You know, when you dive into history, like really dive into it, there comes this moment where you just gasp and feel this icy chill creeping into your soul. Because when it comes to global power struggles, it seems like the story of number two rising up to overtake number one, well, it's pretty much a cursed tale. Someone might say, hey, what about the United States rising up to overtake Britain? Isn't that a good example? Ah, no, not quite. That wasn't a classic showdown. The Anglo Saxon crowd, they're practically family. It was more like passing the torch at Thanksgiving than flipping the table at a family reunion. But other challengers, yikes. Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, yeah, they all ended up in the oops, we tried pile, right? So, here's the question for today. What if number two doesn't rock the boat? What if they just play nice, follow the big boss's lead, and try to rise peacefully? Does that work? Spoiler alert, not always. Today's example. Oh, it's a juicy one. Enter the scene Napoleon III. Yep, the guy who turned the Second French Republic into the Second French Empire. The president turned emperor himself. Now, if you're wondering, wait, how's he related to that Napoleon? Here's the rundown. He's the nephew. His dad, Louis Bonaparte, was Napoleon's younger brother, the one who got shipped off to be King of Holland. So, Napoleon III, born with a golden spoon in his mouth. Thank you very much. He came into this world in 1808. Let's think about that for a second. Napoleon Bonaparte took power in 1799. By 1804, he'd crowned himself Emperor of the French. 1808. That was peak Napoleon era. He was unstoppable, like the Beyonce of European politics. Everything was glitter, glory, and grandeur. It was a time when even the palace curtains probably had gold thread in them. That's the world baby Napoleon III was born into. But, good times don't last, do they? Let's fast forward to 1815. Oh boy, what a year. Uncle Napoleon's comeback tour, the 100 Days, yeah, it ended in spectacular failure at Waterloo. That's when the Bonaparte dream came crashing down. First exile was a warm-up act, Elba wasn't too bad. Second exile, brutal. This time, the British shipped him off to St. Helena, a miserable rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. Imagine this. You're stuck on a tiny island so far from home that you're basically looking at constellations thinking, is that the one over France? Heartbreaking. St. Helena was a British colony at the time, uninhabited, windswept, and about as inviting as a haunted house. Napoleon's life on that island, a bleak. Rumor has it that on his deathbed, he asked for a cup of coffee, and guess what? No coffee. No cappuccino, no espresso, nothing. The guy who once ruled Europe couldn't even get a lat. He had a small entourage, a doctor, 3 officers, and a dozen servants. Fun fact, one of those officers only tagged along to dodge creditors. Yeah, imagine going into exile just to avoid paying your tab. By 1815, the Bonaparte family wasn't just down on its luck, they were flat out broke. The mighty empire, reduced to a sad island and some coffee-less mornings. That's the fall of Napoleon. The downfall of the Bonaparte family didn't just end with Uncle Napoleon's exile. Oh no, it cast a long shadow, and the one standing right under it, Napoleon III. At the time, he was just a 7-year-old kid, clutching his mom's hand as they wandered from country to country across Europe. But let's be real, where in Europe was going to welcome another Napoleon. The Holy Alliance, Russia, Austria, Germany. Forget it. Those countries wanted nothing to do with Bonaparte's. Spain and Holland. They had been on the receiving end of Napoleon's diplomatic campaigns, so no luck there either. What did his mother do? She thought, all right, let's try Geneva. They had a property there. Yes, even in exile, they had real estate. Today, that probably be seized as foreign assets. But back then, it was still theirs. Unfortunately, even Geneva wasn't safe. The local government basically said, yeah, thanks for visiting, but we can't have you here. Move along. So, mother and son became wanderers, living in Switzerland, the German borderlands, and Italy. Most of Napoleon III's childhood was spent in Italy, growing up in the shadow of his family's shattered legacy. A tough start, no doubt, but the kid had resilience. Now, discipline. Not so much. From an early age, Napoleon III was obsessed with restoring the Bonaparte glory days. Reading his biography, you get the sense that he was like a 3D printer hooked up to history, constantly downloading data about his uncle and trying to recreate Napoleon's achievements right down to the uniforms and the imperial vibe. Fast forward to 1848, and our guy finally sees his moment. After years of exile, he leaves Britain and heads back to France. Why? France had just overthrown its king in yet another revolution. Napoleon III strides in like, hey everyone, I'm back. France needs me, and I'm ready to rule. His cousin apparently thought he'd lost his mind. And honestly, who wouldn't? But guess what? He pulled it off. This man, who had neither a loyal army nor a significant reputation, somehow became president of France in 1848. 4 years later, in 1852, he declared himself emperor. How did that happen? What kind of magic trick was this? Let's break it down. After Napoleon Bonaparte's downfall, France went through two royal restorations. First, there was the Bourbon comeback, a case of let's stick a random aristocrat back on the throne. Spoiler alert, didn't last. Then came the July monarchy, which also crumbled in the 1848 revolution. That year, revolutions were sweeping across Europe like wildfire, but in France, it hit differently. The French, with their flair for drama and a hefty dose of romanticism, declared a new republic. Here's the kicker: most of the population couldn't even read, but they knew one name: Napoleon. His legacy had seeped into the national psyche, and when they heard Bonaparte, they thought, yeah, that's a name we trust. Thought into Napoleon III, who knew how to play the nostalgia card like a maestro. France was ready for another Bonaparte, and he was more than ready to take the stage. When Napoleon III returned to France and ran for president, let's just say his ready-summe wasn't exactly stellar. He had zero political experience, had spent most of his life in exile, and, oh yeah, was a convicted felon sentenced to life imprisonment. Not exactly your typical frontrunner, right? But as soon as he set foot in France, the election kicked off, and the people, especially the working class, rallied behind him. Why? Simple, he was a Bonaparte. The name carried weight. Napoleon I had promised land to the peasants, dignity to the workers, and painted a glorious image of a France that dominated Europe. When it came time to vote, the people thought, who else could we possibly choose? So, without ever holding office, Napoleon III became president. But then came the next head scratcher. Okay, president is one thing, but how did he leapfrog into becoming emperor? That's a whole different level of audacity. To understand that, we need to look at the times he lived in. Back then, the whole idea of democracy and elections wasn't exactly baked into the public consciousness. France was still figuring out how to do this whole republic thing, and let's be honest, it was a mess. After the monarchy fell, the new government was like a revolving door. Leaders came and went faster than fashion trends. In that chaos, people were desperate for stability, and who better to promise stability than a Bonaparte? With the family name alone, Napoleon III had a massive edge in the popularity department. But let's not forget the Second French Republic's brilliant constitutional design. Karl Marx, of all people, called out one glaring flaw. The president's term was limited to just one 4 year stint with no re election. Imagine that. You're practically begging the guy to stage a coup if he wants to stay in power. And in 19th century France, people hadn't yet mastered the modern art of creative term limits like, say, Putin. So, what was left? Force? Napoleon III took his charm tour to the south of France. He gave speeches to the crowds while his loyal followers blended into the masses, testing the waters by shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" If the people joined in, great. If not, no harm done, it was just a test. By the end of his little PR roadshow, he knew he had the people's backing. And boy, did the people back him. When he was elected president, he'd already scored an impressive 4 million votes, a landslide. But when he declared himself emperor, that number jumped to over 7 million. This guy didn't just have support, he had the kind of public approval most leaders can only dream of. Now, if Napoleon III had died or stepped down in 1870, history might remember him as a dashing and successful ruler. For 20 years, under his reign, France was booming. The empire flourished, and the Industrial Revolution in France didn't just happen, it skyrocketed. During his 20 years in power, French industrial output doubled. The country became a model of progress and modernization. Factories were humming, railroads were crisscrossing the landscape, and Paris was being transformed into the modern, iconic city we know today. If there's one thing Napoleon III understood, it was how to push forward the advanced forces of production. Let's talk about the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, a humiliation that marked the bitter end of Napoleon III's reign. After France's defeat, the Prussians, led by Otto von Bismarck, slapped France with a colossal war indemnity, 5 billion francs. 5 billion. And how did Bismarck arrive at that magic number? Not because Germany needed reparations, no. Bismarck made it clear that this was a deliberate economic chokehold. He believed that this debt would crush France's economy for years, ensuring they stayed down while Germany rose to dominance. Oh, what didn't he anticipate? The French went, 5 billion. Sure, hold my wine. They rallied, scraped together the funds faster than anyone thought possible, and their economy bounced back with a vengeance. France not only paid off the indemnity, but also roared ahead economically, leaving Bismarck scratching his head and reevaluating his master plan. Now, Napoleon III wasn't just a name, he was a symbol. He carried on the Bonaparte legacy of representing the common folk, especially the farmers and rural populations far from the Parisian elite. His policies often prioritized these neglected communities, making him a leader who genuinely resonated with the broader public. And Paris, Under Napoleon III, the City of Light underwent a transformation that redefined urban planning forever. He championed a massive modernization project for Paris, something no French ruler before him had dared to tackle. The Paris we know today, the grand boulevards, the clean cityscape, the sprawling sewer systems, it all began under his watch. Take the sewers, for instance. Victor Hugo even immortalized them in Les Miserables. Before Napoleon III, Paris was, let's be honest, a bit of a mess. The new sewer system drastically improved public health and set a benchmark for modern cities. Compare that to cities like modern Beijing, where urban flooding still causes casualties. Thanks to Napoleon III, post renovation Paris no longer dealt with such disasters, and the boulevards, those broad, straight avenues radiating out from the Arc de Triomphe. That's all him. They didn't just make Paris beautiful, they had a profound political impact. See, pre renovation Paris was a labyrinth of narrow streets, perfect for revolutionaries to build barricades and stage uprisings. With the new boulevards, barricades became a thing of the past. The city became harder to lock down, and uprisings like the old days are practically impossible. In fact, after the Paris Commune of 1871, Paris never saw another large scale rebellion. It's a textbook case of urban planning shaping political stability. During his 2-decade rule, Napoleon III pushed France into an era of unprecedented growth. The economy soared, culture flourished, and Paris became the blueprint for modern cities worldwide. For a time, it seemed like the empire he envisioned was alive and thriving. But then, as always, the cracks appeared. Here's the tragedy of Napoleon III, and really of anyone trying to live up to a myth. His entire identity, his legitimacy, was tied to the name Bonaparte and the glory of his uncle. And there's the rub. Every decision, every ambition of his reign was driven by the impossible dream of recreating Napoleon I's era of power and prestige. Remember what I said before. Every gain is the beginning of loss. Napoleon III got the crown because of the name, but once he had it, he was trapped by its weight. He had to prove every day that he deserved it. Could he ever truly live up to it? That's the question that haunted his reign and ultimately unraveled it. Let's rewind and look at the glory Napoleon I achieved, the kind of glory Napoleon III could only dream of. Picture this: Napoleon Bonaparte standing in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, with the Pope himself, the old and frail Pius VII, all the way from Rome, ready to crown him emperor. But Napoleon, oh, he wasn't about to wait for the Pope's trembling hands. He snatched the crown and placed it on his own head, then crowned Josephine, his empress. That moment, immortalized in a famous painting, it wasn't just about becoming emperor, it was about asserting dominance over the Pope, over Europe, over the world. That was Napoleon I's ultimate flex. He had crushed the Holy Roman Empire into irrelevance, forced its dissolution, and dragged the Pope to Paris for the symbolic coup de grace. That's why that moment was iconic. A man with cannonballs and sheer audacity rewriting history. Now imagine being Napoleon III, trying to live up to that. It's like wanting to dunk like Michael Jordan when you're barely touching the rim. But here's where things get fascinating. What does it even mean to be an emperor in Europe? The title, an emperor, originates from ancient Rome. It's not just some fancy word. Historically, to be an emperor in Europe was to claim the legacy of Rome itself. And the Pope, He was the gatekeeper of that legacy, the one who bestowed divine legitimacy. That's why crowning ceremonies were such a big deal. It wasn't just about the hat, it was about sealing a deal between God and earthly power. Napoleon I's brilliance was in flipping the script. He didn't just accept the Pope's authority, he asserted his own, literally taking the crown into his own hands. But Napoleon III, he was stuck in the shadow of this legacy. He wanted the same moment, but the world wasn't playing along. The Pope, based hundreds of miles away, refused to recognize him. You want a coronation? Fine, come to Rome, and I'll do it. The Pope might as well have said. But Napoleon III went to Rome, it would undermine everything his uncle stood for. He had to have the Pope come to Paris. He had to recreate the glory on his home turf. Otherwise, he wasn't Napoleon. But what if the Pope wouldn't come? Well, then you bend over backward to stay on his good side. That's exactly what Napoleon III did. He spent his reign appeasing the Pope. Whenever the Pope asked for help, Napoleon III answered, even sending French troops to crush the Roman Republic and defend the Vatican's interests. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was devotion. And yet, the Pope never gave him what he wanted. No trip to Paris, no coronation redux. The Pope remained, as far as Napoleon III was concerned, the elusive goddess he could never win over. This unrequited relationship shaped much of Napoleon III's foreign policy. France became the self-proclaimed protector of Catholics everywhere from the Middle East to the Far East. Whether it was safeguarding holy sites or intervening in disputes involving Catholic interests, Napoleon III was always at the front lines, waving the flag of faith and legitimacy. But the irony, for all his efforts, for all his sacrifices, that elusive crown of glory, the one he wanted to snatch for himself, just like his uncle, never materialized. Napoleon III might have ruled an empire, but in his heart, he was always chasing a shadow. Napoleon III's obsession with winning the Pope's favor led him to adopt a wildly ambitious and ultimately disastrous policy in the Americas. The man had this dream, or maybe a delusion, of building a grand Catholic empire in Latin America, south of the United States. Why? Well, his wife was Spanish, he was Catholic, and he thought, a let's play family empire building with the church as our anchor. So he started meddling in Central and South America, stirring up chaos, particularly in Mexico. His big idea: create a puppet empire in Mexico to counterbalance the growing power of the United States. But there's the rub: this wasn't Napoleon I with global ambitions. This was Napoleon III, stuck on regional chess moves. The most absurd moment: during the American Civil War, when the United States was ripping itself apart, most sane leaders would sit back, maybe offer a few diplomatic words, and watch the drama unfold. Not Napoleon III. He threw his weight behind the Confederacy, whispering promises of support, even though he wasn't ready to commit fully. And guess what? When the war ended and the Union emerged stronger than ever, that half baked meddling effectively ended the long standing, special relationship between France and America. This was Napoleon III in a nutshell: grand dreams, half measures, and a knack for souring relationships. His actions in America weren't just misguided, they were a direct result of the thorn planted in his soul, the unrelenting desire to recapture the glory of Napoleon I. That thorn, though, it wasn't just about the Americas. His entire reign was defined by it. From the moment he took office, Napoleon III carried the impossible burden of living up to his name. The French people elected him because they believed he was a reincarnation of his uncle, the man who reshaped Europe. But the problem? If he failed, if he lost even a single war, it would shatter the myth of the Bonaparte legacy. And fail he did, unlike his uncle, who was a military genius. Napoleon III wasn't exactly brimming with confidence on the battlefield. Sure, he wrote a few pamphlets about artillery, but that doesn't make you Napoleon I. He knew this too. That's why he avoided direct conflicts as much as possible, favoring alliances and distant skirmishes to keep the stakes low. His strategy: stick close to Britain. Aligning with the world's most powerful nation was his way of hedging his bets. If they fought together and lost, he could say, "Hey, even Britain lost." A safety net for his domestic legitimacy, and when it came to war, he preferred fighting far off enemies to minimize political fallout at home. Losing a distant war wouldn't immediately threaten his throne. Losing close to home, catastrophic. These two insecurities, the fear of losing France's fragile international standing and the need for the Pope's validation, became twin thorns in his side. Over 2 decades, they festered and grew, shaping his every decision. By 1870, on the eve of the Franco-Prussian War, his web of alliances and policies had tangled into a geopolitical disaster. His relationships with neighboring countries were strained to the breaking point. Russia resented him after the Crimean War. Austria held grudges over his meddling with Italy, and Britain, despite their alliance, adhered to its classic balance of power strategy, backing Germany to counteract France's growing influence. When push came to shove, Britain was never going to side with France against Germany. This was the tragic culmination of Napoleon III's reign. His attempts to restore Bonaparte glory had alienated every major power in Europe. By the time he faced Prussia, France stood isolated, outmaneuvered, and teetering on the brink of collapse. All because of those two thorns, his vanity and his need for validation, planted deep in his heart, growing unchecked until they consumed him. The German question, the final nail in the coffin for the Second French Empire. By the 1860s, Prussia wasn't just rising, it was surging, driven by a wave of nationalistic fervor and sheer genius leadership. Think about it: Otto von Bismarck, Helmut von Moltke, and their crew had been scheming for years. They knew that to unify the scattered German states, they had to take down the biggest obstacle in their way: France. Why? Because France was the big, swaggering neighbor who could veto German unification anytime it felt like it. Bismarck knew this, and he hated it. In his memoirs, he admitted he'd been preparing for war with France for years, predicting it would happen within 5 years, then narrowing it down to 2. This guy wasn't just talking, he was planning. Meanwhile, Prussia wasn't just building an army, they were revolutionizing warfare. They created the most advanced general staff in the world, and even their railways were designed with troop movements in mind. This wasn't a country getting ready for a skirmish. This was a nation gearing up for a systematic takedown of a rival. And Napoleon III, oh, he was in a bind. On the surface, he had to maintain the image of France as Europe's unstoppable powerhouse. Who haven't I bullied? Russia, Austria, Czech, Italy, Prussia. What's one more? But deep down, he knew the truth. France wasn't ready. And the army was unprepared, logistics were a mess, and there was no coherent strategy for war. Yet, he couldn't back down now either. His entire legitimacy as emperor was tied to the idea of Bonaparte invincibility. He had to keep up the charade, even if it meant plunging his country into disaster. And disaster it was. The Franco Prussian War began because Napoleon III, ironically, started it. He declared war. Why? Because Bismarck was a master provocateur and he handed Napoleon a bait he couldn't resist. Let's set the scene. 1870, the Spanish throne becomes vacant, and a candidate from the Prussian Hohenzollern family is in the running. France, furious. The idea of a Prussian king in Spain was like putting a German flag on both sides of France. It was a geopolitical nightmare. Napoleon III demanded that Prussia back off, and King Wilhelm of Prussia said, "Fine, we'll withdraw our candidate." Crisis averted, right? Not for Napoleon III. He doubled down, insisting that Prussia issue a formal written apology, something to humiliate them publicly. So, he sent an ambassador to demand that King Wilhelm write a formal letter. The king, understandably annoyed, refused, but politely. And then history delivered its twist. Wilhelm sent a telegram about the incident to Bismarck outlining the polite refusal. Bismarck, the chess master, saw his opening. He edited the telegram just enough to make it sound like the king had insulted the French ambassador. Then he released it to the press. France, outraged. Napoleon III, already backed into a corner by public opinion, had no choice but to declare war. And that's exactly what Bismarck wanted. Prussia was ready, France was not. The war began disastrously for France. Troops couldn't be mobilized effectively, supplies didn't reach the front, and there was no clear plan. It was chaos. Bismarck had set the stage perfectly, and Napoleon III walked straight into the trap. The result: France was humiliated. Napoleon III was captured at Sedan, and the Second French Empire crumbled almost overnight. Bismarck's dream of German unification became a reality, and France's era of dominance came to an end. All because of a telegram, or more accurately, because Napoleon III was so desperate to live up to his name that he let pride and fear dictate his decisions. That thorn of Bonaparte glory, it didn't just hurt, it bled him dry. Let's set the stage. July 14th, 1870, France's national holiday. The streets were alive with celebration, people waving flags and cheering, until bam, the morning papers hit the stands. There it was, the infamous Ems dispatch, slimmed down and sharpened by none other than Otto von Bismarck. Now, what Bismarck did wasn't falsification. Oh no, that would have been amateurish. Instead, he masterfully condensed the original message, stripping it of any diplomatic niceties, turning it into a cold, clipped rebuff. The French ambassador is no longer needed, and there's nothing more to discuss. Short, blunt, and perfectly designed to poke the bear. And then, to twist the knife further, Bismarck released the dispatch on July 14th, France's National Day. You can imagine the reaction. The French public, already riding high on patriotic fervor, read the papers and exploded with outrage. What? The Prussian king insulted us on our own day. War. To Berlin, the streets of Paris were flooded with chants of fury, and the collective cry for war became deafening. What could Napoleon III do? He was Napoleon, or at least he was supposed to be. A Bonaparte couldn't sit back and take an insult like that, not when the public was baying for blood. His hand was forced. Declaring war wasn't an option, it was an inevitability. So he gave the order. But the truth, France wasn't ready. Not militarily, not logistically, and certainly not in terms of leadership. And Napoleon III himself, he was a shell of the man the public thought he was. His health was in shambles, constant pain, barely able to ride a horse, relying on opium to dull the agony. Yet he felt he had no choice but to lead the charge. The war began and the disaster unfolded almost immediately. Troops couldn't be mobilized effectively. Supplies didn't reach the front lines. Command structures were a mess. Napoleon himself, unable to keep up with the demands of war, handed over military leadership to a marshal, only adding to the chaos. The final act came at Sedan, a small town nestled in a valley. On September 1st, 1870, the Prussian army had completely encircled the French forces. It was a slaughter waiting to happen. Prussian artillery rained down mercilessly, and within hours, the French sent out their white flag. Napoleon III surrendered personally. He sent a message to King Wilhelm of Prussia. My dear brother, I could not die in battle, so I lay my sword at your feet. And just like that, the Second French Empire collapsed. Napoleon was taken prisoner, and France was thrown into turmoil. The Bonaparte legacy, once synonymous with triumph, was reduced to ashes. Napoleon III fled to London with his family, where he lived out his final days in obscurity, a broken man clinging to the last remnants of his family's faded glory. Why tell this story? Because it's a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what happens when pride and emotion override strategy and foresight. Napoleon III's greatest flaw wasn't just his vanity, it was his inability to separate his personal ambitions and emotional impulses from the strategic needs of his nation. Whether it was clashing with Russia, meddling in Italy, or picking a fight with Prussia, he was driven more by a desire to restore Bonaparte glory than by rational calculations of France's long term interests. His victories were fleeting, but his failures left scars that lasted generations. Decades later, Charles de Gaulle summarized it best: every victory of Napoleon III's era was temporary, every defeat left a permanent wound. And therein lies the lesson: glory may shine bright for a moment, but the consequences of failure endure forever.